You're watching the legal breakdown. So, Glenn, there is an ongoing investigation in Fulton County, Georgia, and that's regarding Trump's call with Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, demanding that he find 11,780 votes that didn't exist. Now, a special grand jury was convened, and that grand jury has now completed its report. So, first, why was a special grand jury convened? And second, what comes next now that that report's complete?
The good news is this feels like progress. So Georgia has a somewhat unusual dual grand jury system. Usually jurisdictions just have one grand jury. That grand jury issues subpoenas, hears testimony, and votes out indictments. In Georgia, the regular grand jury cannot compel witnesses to testify. The regular grand jury doesn't have subpoena power. So you have to ask the court to convene a special grand jury to exercise the subpoena power to force or compel reluctant witnesses to testify. And boy, did District Attorney Fani Willis have her hands full with lots of reluctant witnesses, Donald Trump's, lackeys and lapdogs who didn't want to testify. So that's why she had to seek to have a judge impanel the special grand jury. And now, as you say, that grand jury has completed its work. It's issued a report and it's been resolved. And now they move on to next steps.
So, when are we going to find out who the Fulton County DA was trying to get to compel to testify?
So there is an open question right now about whether the special grand jury's report will become public. And I'll talk about that in a second. But I think it's really interesting that District Attorney Willis has been sort of persistently sawing the justice wood and defeating Donald Trump loyalists one after another after another. And this is why she needed the special grand jury, because she subpoenaed Mike Flynn, who desperately didn't want to have to testify before a Georgia state grand jury about the crimes of Donald Trump. So, of course, he went to court. He tried to avoid testifying. And boy, Fani Willis just beat the pants off him. He appeared and he testified. Rudy Giuliani, same thing. He didn't want to have to testify about Donald Trump's crimes, went to court. Fani Willis beat him and he appeared and testified. And Lindsey Graham, Senator Lindsey Graham, so desperately didn't want to have to testify before the Georgia state grand jury about Donald Trump's crimes that he fought it all the way up to the Supreme Court, and District Attorney Willis beat him and he had to appear before the grand jury and testify. So now what happens is this is all secret by law. So the special grand jury has issued a report. Fani Willis has it. And there's a court hearing in Georgia. The case is being presided over, or I should say the grand jury matter is being presided over by Judge McBurney, a Georgia state judge. And on January 24th, he's going to hear arguments on whether the grand jury's report should become public or should remain secret while Fani Willis moves on to the next phase of her investigation. Here's what the next phase looks like. She will take the work of the special grand jury and she will present it to the regular grand jury in Georgia. That is the grand jury empowered to indict people. And I have to believe, Brian, if we read the tea leaves, I suspect the special grand jury found evidence of crime. How could they not, given that notorious phone call? Look, just find me 11,780 votes and corruptly declare me the winner. Let me add that the other participant in that call, Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger from Georgia, he testified before the special grand jury about that phone call. So if the special grand jury has recommended in its report that criminal charges should be brought against one or more people, I have to believe Fani Willis will go into the regular grand jury, will present that report, will summarize the evidence that was developed before the special grand jury, and she will ask the regular Georgia grand jury to vote out indictments.
Now, we know that that special grand jury's report isn't public, but what about the regular grand jury that's been convened? Are we gonna be able to follow along with that publicly?
It will all be done behind closed doors in secret. The only thing we will know is when and if an indictment has been issued and unsealed. That is typically at the moment an arrest is made or a negotiated turn-in is agreed to between the prosecutors and the defense attorneys representing the target, indeed, if the target ends up being Donald Trump. So the answer is no, unfortunately. We're going to be kept in the dark unless and until an indictment issues.
Is that normal? Like, are all grand jury cases, at least in the state of Georgia, behind closed doors? Isn't this something that usually we're able to follow along with, at least in other states?
Almost all grand juries are secret by law because, and there are really some important policy considerations behind that. If we prosecutors are in the grand jury investigating somebody for potential crime, and it turns out we don't have enough evidence to indict the person, or maybe we got it wrong, the person didn't commit a crime, the last thing you want to do is to have that information out in the public square because, the person who might be wrongfully accused can never get his or her reputation back. We also do it, Brian, to protect the witnesses that we call before the grand jury, because we want them to feel comfortable that they can fully testify about the crimes of others without their names prematurely being thrown into the public square so people can, tamper with them like we learned Team Trump tampered with Cassidy Hutchinson.
Now, what would you imagine the timeline is for the grand jury trial in Fulton County? Because wouldn't it stand to reason that, it's pretty straightforward that both sides present, they cross-examine, and the jury deliberates, and then we hear a verdict?
Yeah, so here's the good news. In the grand jury, now that Fani Willis is moving back to the regular grand jury, I think the time frame can actually be fairly short and condensed. Here's why. All of the witnesses, all of the evidence was presented to the special grand jury, and they issued a report summarizing it all and making their recommendation. Now, Fani Willis doesn't have to present all that evidence anew to the regular grand jury. She simply has to present the report, perhaps summarize a little bit of the information that was developed by the special grand jury, and ask that grand jury to return indictments. Importantly, the only people who are allowed inside a grand jury are the prosecutor, the grand jurors, and a grand jury court reporter taking down verbatim every word that is said in the grand jury. There is no judge, there's no defense attorney, there's never a defendant. In fact, Brian, when I would go into the grand jury day after day, when I was a federal prosecutor in DC, I wasn't even permitted to take in one of my FBI agents or my homicide detectives. It is a very strict and closely held proceeding. So there's no judge, no cross-examination. And I think Fani Willis can move toward an indictment literally in the matter of the next couple of weeks.
Copy that. Now, here's the fun part. Who chooses the punishment, and what will the range of that sentencing be? And would it surprise you if Trump did get indicted that his sentence would differ from what we would normally expect for?
Yeah, so we've got a few steps between the time an indictment is issued and the time a judge is wrestling with the question of what's the appropriate sentence, the appropriate punishment for Donald Trump's crimes. After the indictment issues, the case then moves into the trial court. Trial date will be set, the trial will be held, and in the event of a conviction, it will be the judge who decides what is the appropriate punishment. Is it, for example, prison time? Is it home confinement in lieu of prison time? Which, let me tell you, as a former career prosecutor, I was never a fan of home confinement because that feels like somebody who's been convicted by a jury of their peers of committing felony crimes being sentenced to basically, binge watch Netflix and get DoorDash delivered. That never did feel like much of a punishment or a sanction to me.
Yeah, I feel like I'm on home confinement right now. I feel like I've been on home confinement for the last few years here. Okay, so on the issue of what I think is swirling around here is this issue of lenient sentencing. And with that said, we just did see something like that with Alan Weisselberg. He is the CFO of the Trump org. He was just sentenced to a paltry 5 months in prison in the Trump Organization fraud case. Can I get your reaction to that?
My reaction is Alan Weisselberg remains on Team Trump. He remains in the fold. He may have testified as a witness, a cooperating witness who was cooperating with the state court prosecutors, but by all accounts, he never did give up Donald Trump. In fact, in his trial testimony, it seems like he protected Donald Trump. And the fact is, Brian, he pleaded guilty to 15 charges, including the lead count, a 15-year-long criminal scheme to defraud in the first degree, a massive tax fraud scheme. And Alan Weisselberg and the Trump Organization, and I maintain Donald Trump, defrauded the taxpayers of the city of New York the taxpayers of the state of New York, and of necessity, all of us, the federal taxpayers. Why do I say that? Well, rarely does a bandit, a federal tax cheat, lie on their state taxes, but fully report all their income on their federal taxes. Come on, right? And here is what's so troubling. Not only was it a paltry, as you put it, 5 months. Now it's going to be in Rikers. So, 5 minutes in Rikers in New York is no fun. But he will also have his sentence likely reduced to about 100 days, assuming he gets good time credit. And I don't imagine he's going to be running around Rikers, shanking people. Doesn't seem like Alan Weisselberg's jam.
Yeah.
But that really is an extraordinarily lenient sentence for the crimes he pleaded guilty to. But here is really the worst thing in my view. These federal tax crimes were committed. No two ways about it. But they have gone entirely unprosecuted. Alan Weisselberg has never been charged with a federal tax crime by the Department of Justice, nor has the Trump Organization, and obviously nor has Donald Trump. I don't understand how that can be. Why Donald Trump has all of these fall guys around him, like Alan Weisselberg, and remember Michael Cohen, his former lawyer, who went to prison for, among other things, being in a campaign finance conspiracy to pay off playmates and porn stars at the direction of and for the benefit of Donald Trump. He went to prison. Donald Trump has never been held accountable, not 1 minute, for his federal crimes. I have no explanation for why that is, other than it feels like a persistent failure of the Department of Justice.
If the federal government was to hold Alan Weisselberg accountable, does it have to emanate from the DOJ, or can a U.S. attorney's office anywhere in the country, like in the Southern District of New York, for example, can they move to hold him accountable?
Yeah, so the U.S. attorney's offices around the country, including the ones in New York, are the field offices of the Department of Justice. So when we use the term Department of Justice, we are including in that all 93 United States attorneys' offices around the country. Listen, if any U.S. attorney's office was going to go against a former president, believe me, the decisions would be made out of what we call main justice, the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C.
So I guess at this point, if we were looking for an explanation, it would probably be looking toward Merrick Garland as to why or why not we're not seeing any action against Alan Weisselberg, correct?
It is. That's going to be a decision for the leadership of the Department of Justice, the Attorney General Merrick Garland, the Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco. Let me highlight just one thing that the New York State judge, Judge Marchand, said at Alan Weisselberg's sentencing. He said, you know what? I'm really upset by one thing you did in particular. And the judge highlighted this. He said, you cut your wife a bogus check from the Trump Organization for $6,000 so she could obtain Social Security benefits. Brian, that's a federal crime. That may also violate the state laws of New York, but that's a federal crime. And it is a mystery to me why the federal authorities have given not only Alan Weisselberg, but Donald Trump a pass on every single federal crime that we have virtually been beaten over the head with over the past several years. We've seen not 1 minute of accountability for Trump, and I really hope that changes.
Yeah, as do I. And hopefully, as these special counsel investigations continue to bear down on him, we'll see some movement, and especially in Fulton County. And we'll keep an eye on that as we get more updates on that one. So for anybody watching, if you want to check out more legal news, make sure to follow both of our channels. Links are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
This is The Legal Breakdown.